Miley Cyrus is undoubtedly one of the most successful ex-Disney Channel acts. While she initially gained fame from her role on Hannah Montana, her transition from child-friendly music to a more mature sound would get even more eyes on her. While it's easy to pinpoint her 2013 album, Bangers, as the moment she fully made this transition, Miley had been gradually aging up her music and image for years, and her 2010 album, Can't Be Tamed, is the most obvious example of this. While it's ironically a very tame record compared to her later discography, this album would act as a taste to the freer and more experimental Miley we know today. By 2010, Miley Cyrus was a household name. Her previous records, Breakout and Meet Miley Cyrus, both hit number 1 on the Billboard 200, and she had several smash hits that were radio staples, including Party in the USA and Seven Things. Having achieved so much success at a young age came with its challenges though. Miley was still starring in Hannah Montana, a Disney Channel show for kids, which made it hard for critics and adults to take her seriously. In addition to this, the pressures and expectations of being a child star weighed heavily on her, limiting her creativity not only in her public image, but also her music. Her early discography is extremely bubbly teen pop, and while that worked for Hannah Montana, it wasn't exactly what Miley wanted to do for the rest of her career. Going into her 7th overall record, Miley wanted to make it clear that she wasn't always going to maintain her squeaky clean image, and this was immediately apparent with the album's lead single, Can't Be Tamed. The song is a dance pop track about her breaking free from her metaphorical chains, and how she won't let anyone hold her back from being herself. The video sees her as a bird literally breaking out of a cage, with admittedly pretty wide bars, I mean who is this stopping, and wreaking havoc on a museum with her other bird friends. Believe it or not, this was very shocking at the time. I remember this had all the mothers clutching their pearls, and kids my age were shook at the darker tone. This was definitely a risky move to make, especially considering Miley was still on Hollywood Records, which is a label primarily known for housing family-friendly Disney Channel acts. The fact that it was even released with the label's backing is shocking in and of itself, despite how innocent it might seem nowadays. I remember I loved this video when it first came out. Her outfit, hair, and makeup was such a serve to me, and honestly, it's still one of my favorite Miley looks. I also wasn't the brightest child, since for the longest time, I thought the wings she had were real, but looking back, they're very obviously CGI. I guess that's why she was able to slip out of that cage so easily. Miley would cause some controversy when she performed this song on Britain's Got Talent. During the performance, she simulated kissing a female backup dancer. Once again, even though this wouldn't be a big deal if she did this now, this was actually pretty scandalous at the time. Remember, she was still starring in Hannah Montana, and Disney wasn't pretending to like gay people as much back then, so this was pretty unexpected. The album itself dropped in June 2010, and it was obvious that she intended this to be her edgiest record to date. The cover alone was attention-grabbing, showing a more provocative side to her that not many people were anticipating. This newfound maturity would be reflected throughout the record, as Can't Be Tamed ditches the bubblegum teen pop of her previous works in favor of straight-up dance pop. This is probably Miley's most techno and club-oriented album to date, with heavy bass and synth production reminiscent of the late 2000s and early 2010s. Right from the opening track, Liberty Walk, it was clear what direction this album was going in, as the song is a frenetic dance track about leaving behind everything that holds you down. It's a bold way to start, but I think it works perfectly. Not only is the production good at establishing the sound of the album, but the lyrics about remaining true to yourself and not being afraid to move on in your life are genuinely empowering. The message might have rang hollow had it came from another artist, but I truly hear Miley's passion when listening to this. Given her background as someone who was forced to have a certain image, this song makes total sense for her. Speaking of being forced into a certain image, the song Robot is actually about that very topic. In it, she describes how she feels like a robot who's been told what to do to appease the system she's in. This song really shattered the illusion of Miley's image at the time, stating plain and clear that she was not happy with how she was being treated. This was another song that scandalized Little Me. I think everyone at the time knew she wasn't totally happy with her kid-friendly reputation, but I was just taken aback by how bold she was in saying it. Again, it's crazy how she did this while being on Hollywood Records, which is essentially Disney's label. Even more shocking to me was the song Permanent December. which is actually my favorite off this album. Right in the first verse, she's talking about sexy boys. The second verse has a Lolita reference. I could not believe my little ears. The song itself is just so much fun though. It has an absolutely massive chorus. The verses, for as silly as they are so much fun to sing along with, and the futuristic sounding production sets it all over the top for me. It's one of my favorite Miley Cyrus songs, if not my actual favorite, and it stays on my dance playlist, along with the second single from this era, Who Owns My Heart. I feel like this song doesn't get a ton of love nowadays, but I always preferred it to Can't Be Tamed. It sounds like a Fame Monster era Lady Gaga song, with its pulsating synth beat and Miley's dramatic performance. The song didn't really do much commercially, not even charting on the US Hot 100. Miley actually performed it at the 2020 iHeartRadio Music Festival, and I was ecstatic that it actually got some acknowledgement after a decade of being underappreciated. While I love the more upbeat tracks on this album, Can't Be Tamed isn't solely made up of club bangers. Miley covered the iconic Poison power ballad Every Rose Has Its Thorn, and even collaborated with the band's frontman, Bret Michaels, to make it. This was among the first of many rock covers she'd end up doing in her career, specifically during her Plastic Hearts era in 2020. Miley definitely has a voice that suits rock music nowadays, but I don't think she really perfected that style just yet with this cover. Her delivery is a little too cloying, and the twinkly production makes the song lack a huge emotional punch. It's definitely not bad though, and I think it's super interesting to look back at one of the first times Miley would pay tribute to this kind of music before she would go all in with Plastic Hearts. The closing track, My Heart Beats for Love, is the better power ballad of the two, although I never was crazy over that song either. I do love a grand sounding, dramatic song like this, but it never felt like it really belonged on this album to me. I don't think Can't Be Tamed leans hard enough into its glam rock elements to really justify a huge power ballad like this, and it makes the album end on a kind of confusing note. The same applies to Forgiveness and Love, the other ballad. I never really liked the song a lot. It's not bad, but it sounds like a leftover from her earlier records, with its overly saccharine lyrics. Stay is the best slow moment on this album, in my opinion. She gives a good emotional performance, but again, it never really hit for me. Maybe that's because it's on an album that I go to for upbeat dance songs, but I don't think Stay ever stuck the emotional landing for me, especially compared to her earlier ballads, like The Climb or Bottom of the Ocean. This is where I think Can't Be Tamed stumbles a bit. I don't think it's a bad thing to have slower moments in a mostly upbeat album, but the ones here don't really mesh with the album's vibe. In my opinion, they kind of hold it back from having the bite that it wants to. I think if they had leaned more into being heavy glam rock arena style songs, mixed with electronic elements to make them cohesive with the rest of the tracks, they would have helped the album feel even more like a progression of Miley's sound. As it stands though, Can't Be Tamed is the definition of an in-between album. The boundary-pushing, free-spirited Miley we know today really was born on this record, but creative constraints forced upon her by her label held the album back from reaching its full potential. Miley herself didn't even seem to like it, at least in terms of its electropop style, saying the music didn't inspire her, and that she was blending in with other artists. Miley has become somewhat infamous for not liking whatever her last record was, and this seemed to be one of the first times she was vocal about it. It's strange to me because I consider this album to be where she really started to use her voice. She even has writing credits on all the tracks, aside from Every Rose Has Its Thorn. The lyrics are very revealing of her emotions, so it's weird to hear her say that this wasn't inspiring to her. Maybe she felt like she had to hold back in the lyrical content because of her association with Disney. And maybe she didn't like the electropop sound of the record, which was probably a direction the label wanted her to go in. Speaking of the label, I can only imagine Hollywood Records must have been apprehensive about this one, as it's not exactly the light and fluffy kind of record other Disney Channel acts were making in 2010. This could explain why they did little to promote it, which led to significantly lower sales compared to her previous albums. In hindsight, it was an extremely Miley move to make a record criticizing the label and team she belonged to, aka the ones who were responsible for pushing that very record. This risk seemed to pay off in some ways, but not in others. While she succeeded in pushing her image in a more mature direction with her videos and performances, The album itself isn't necessarily as cutting as it could have been. It certainly was shocking at the time, but it never totally stuck in the public consciousness as much as her earlier works, due to the weaker push it received from Hollywood records. It was also immediately overshadowed once Bangers arrived, since that was where Miley got everyone to definitively recognize that she wasn't just a child star. This leaves Can't Be Tamed in a weird place nowadays. I liken it to Selena Gomez's Stars Dance. Both are albums that push the boundary as far as Mickey Mouse will allow, but end up feeling too childlike for adults and lacking in the effervescent fun of their previous records. And even though Stars Dance is my favorite Selena album, I can't say Can't Be Tamed is my favorite Miley album. That crown belongs to either Bangers or Plastic Hearts, but this one is a solid third place. I love the overbearing 2010 electropop production, and the highs of this album are some of my all-time favorite Miley songs. It loses points for me for the somewhat inconsistent tone, but this is still a record I go back to regularly. It may not be her best work, but Can't Be Tamed deserves more respect for being the first significant step Miley made in becoming the artist she is today.